Welcome to ReSounding, a podcast exploring the power of the arts in advocacy and in action. We talk with artists and activists, taking a deep dive into questions surrounding the causes of displacement, the strength and the vulnerability of people on the move, and the potential of the arts to shine a light on social injustice and impact people's lives for the better. My name is Chris Nicholson, and in this episode I spoke to Kate McMillan, a contemporary artist, educator and researcher working at King's College London. Kate has recently completed an immersive exhibition in the heart of London called Never at Sea, a complex multimedia work exploring the connections between migration, the refugee experience, climate change, and colonialism. Hello, Kate. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, hello, Chris. It's lovely to be here talking with you.
There's so many interesting aspects to your work that we want to explore during this podcast as a researcher, educator, and as an artist. But we were hoping maybe we can just begin from that point of art. And perhaps you can share with us a bit of the journey of your recent artwork, Never at Sea.
Absolutely. So as you can probably hear from my voice, I grew up in Australia. And so a lot of my relationship to my practice arises out of this idea of growing up on land stolen by the British that was never ceded. And that there is no treaty with Indigenous people about that land. So my practice, particularly in my earlier career when I was growing up in Australia, was always interested in these tensions around land, around history, around what's remembered, what's forgotten, and so on. So that kind of frames, I guess, my perspective as an artist. So when I moved to London 12 years ago, and where I now work at King's College London as a lecturer in creative practice, I was really interested in how those kind of issues of colonialism also kind of move around and through other conversations about inequality. So, for example, forced migration now, climate change, gender inequality, and the kind of dominance of cities like London in our cultural narratives. Never at Sea was a project that coincided with the pedestrianisation of the Strand, which is a section of London outside of Somerset House that historically was a very busy, polluted area of London. And in the last 12 months, the whole area has been blocked off from traffic. And in the centre of this area is a church called St Mary Le Strand. And even prior to the pedestrianisation, I was really keen to do a project there. It was known as an island church, which was particularly interesting to me. I've written a lot about islands as these spaces that we send people to, that we hide people in. Australia, as you know, was a giant prison island for the British for many years. So a lot of my writing as a researcher has been around, I guess, islands of empire. So I was particularly interested in St Mary Le Strand Church as this island church with very busy traffic running either side of it that was sort of forgotten. And interestingly, it was is the patron church of the Women's Royal Navy. And they were the first women who were allowed into the armed services. And their motto was Never at Sea, because it was a reassurance to the British public that women would never be serving with people's husbands, that they would be safely here in Britain doing women's work. And so that's the title of the project. And that is the starting point. But what happened when I was beginning my research on this was this rhetoric that we are continuing to hear from the Conservative government in the UK and other governments across Europe about stop the boats, and this kind of divisive, reductive rhetoric around forced migration and people seeking asylum, as is their right. And it echoed with similar sentiments that were being politicised in Australia 25 years ago when I was, a very recent art graduate, and there were a number of boats, nothing like on the scale that we're experiencing in Europe, but there were a number of boats that were attempting to make it to Australia, where people were wanting to claim asylum. And as most people know, Australia has a terrible record of incarcerating asylum seekers indefinitely, including women and children, and continues with these policies. And now in Britain, we are trying to mirror some of those policies that are happening in Australia, such as offshore detention, sending migrants to Rwanda with an inability to claim asylum in Britain ever. And these are the sorts of policies that certainly were around in Australia 20 or 30 years ago. So there's this sort of strange collapsing of history where Britain sent all their convicts to Australia to get rid of them onto an island. Australia has continued to use those sorts of island incarceration policies over the last 200 years. And now Britain is in turn mirroring those asylum policies. So there's this sort of strange kind of echoing, haunting of history coming back to empire. But of course, as we know, one of the kind of biggest threats to humanity in the future and currently is the climate crisis, and particularly communities that are coming or that are seeking asylum from areas that are ravaged by drought and other environmental ecological disasters. This is increasingly going to be why we're seeing asylum seekers. So in a way, this work for Never at Sea really tried to bring those issues together. This idea that migrants are increasingly going to be seeking asylum because the communities that they're from are unsustainable, whether it's drought or flood or all the sort of impacts that we're seeing across the world from climate change.
Can you describe your artistic response to this?
Yeah, well, this is really tricky. So, the work took about 2 years to sort of form, and I was very keen to work with as many people as possible, including partners such as the Refugee Council and the Lewisham Resettlement Scheme here in southeast London, where I live, to kind of think about what loss feels like. So loss of our ecology, but also loss of our home and our identity and our culture, and what it means to come to London and find refuge, and what that sort of feels like. And I think that this is a really important role that artists play in these discussions, because of course I could just write an article about it and tell you all the facts and so on, which is important, and many people do this. But I think what art does is it creates this empathic, sticky experience for people, where you can actually change minds through changing hearts, where you can transform people's opinions about things, where you can create something that they keep returning to time and time again. So I was really interested in creating a site-specific work at St Mary Le Strand Church that attended to all of those issues, but really attempted to kind of create an emotional response for the audience. So what you have, if I can sort of paint the picture of the church, as you walk into the church, interestingly, not everyone noticed this because it was quite subtle, but I reversed all the pews. So the altar was facing the back of the church and the altar was behind us. So one of the things that came out of the workshops that I ran with refugee women from the Refugee Council was this feeling of feeling displaced and disorientated, of not knowing how things work, of not really feeling at home. So what I wanted to do for audiences coming into the work in the first instance was to disrupt their experience of the church. So normally, even if you're not particularly religious, you walk into a church, you know the altar is facing ahead of you, and you sit down on the pews and you look towards the altar and you sit quietly with your hands on your lap. You know, there are these sort of rituals of practice in these spaces. So I wanted to disrupt this. So you walk in, you sit down and your back is to the altar and you're faced with the artwork, which becomes like an alternate altar at the back of the church. So on one side we have a film projection, and then on the other side we have another film projection onto a sort of a large kind of white sort of lumpy sculpture that I've been kind of referring to either as a lump or a tumor or something like that, something heavy, something that kind of perhaps refers to the sensation of carrying loss or grief in our body and the way it sits in the stomach as this kind of heavy mass. So I've worked with this idea before of projecting my films onto different kinds of surfaces. So the filming actually took place in Australia in April 2022. And over 2 days, I worked with this fantastic cinematographer called Rick Raffici, who usually does surfing videos, but he had this great underwater camera set up. And we worked with 4 young, amazing actors, and they're filmed on the Indian Ocean, on the sea, so you can't sort of see any land around them. It appears that they're out in the middle of nowhere, but it's the ocean that I grew up looking out. Right. It's the ocean that the Aboriginal people would have seen the British arriving from, obviously the sort of carrying death and destruction with them, decimation of Indigenous culture, but also disease and other things like this. So really thinking about the sea in the broader sense as a site of death. So not just in relation to the climate crisis or forced migration, but in relation to colonialism and the idea that the seas and the oceans were the kind of pathways of the empire, particularly, for inhabitants of the global south. So this is where the film is set. And on the main screen, you mostly see the girls underwater. You see the bottom of the hull. You see them holding hands, clasping each other. It's very beautiful. It's very beautiful imagery, but it's kind of sinister. So a lot of my work deals with this tension between beauty and terror. And then on the other screen that's projected onto the kind of lumpy sort of sculpture is the details of the girls sitting on the boat, looking down at their hands, at their feet, playing with objects in their hands. And so you have this tension of this sort of quite big landscape sort of format of them, the boat moving with the women underwater, these sort of quite beautiful, large kind of format film, coupled with these details that really focus on that sensation, I guess, of when you're stressed, when you're tense, when you're overwhelmed, you might sort of almost shut down and just focus on those small details around you. So that's what I was trying to capture in those two things. And then the sound that accompanies these two films, we pre-recorded in the Brunel Tunnel, which is a tunnel underneath the Thames, which was built during the Victorian era as a sort of a novelty that Victorians could walk underneath the Thames. Of course, the Thames being the estuary of empire, where all the slaving boats and trading boats left from. And we had a Ruthless Jabiru, which is a London-based orchestra, and then an ensemble from Australia called Decibel, which the composer of the sound is the artistic director of, Kat Hope. So we had this incredible venue in December in the deep sort of dark London winter where we recorded the sound, and it's incredibly haunting. And it works with lots of low frequency sounds. So really thinking about what the idea of loss sounds like, and then how sound can connect with us about what loss feels like. So often, I often think about the body as an ear and how sound moves through you. So you have this combination of these beautiful images from the film that are quite mesmerizing, quite slow. They kind of move with your breath and with the currents of the ocean. And then this sort of very unnerving sound that's also kind of beautiful in its own way as well. So it kind of creates that tension. And then I have done things in the church which have kind of also displaced other elements of kind of religious worship, I guess. So, for example, all the kneelers or the prayer cushions in the church, which are usually at the back of the pew, and if you want to kneel down and pray, you take one, you kneel down with it on the floor. I've remade them all. So I've taken stills from my films and I have printed those stills onto the prayer cushions in silk, and then made them all. So to begin with, you might not notice that they're not supposed to be there. So the work kind of, I guess, unfolds as you're sitting in the church and you think, oh gosh, I'm actually sitting in the wrong direction. Oh, what are these prayer cushions? And so on. And then you have this experience of the film. The other element of the artwork is a percussion table. So what we really wanted to do, in addition to having the sort of pre-recorded sound that the films were edited to, is to have a live performance and to really focus on three elements of the work: a live sound performance, thinking about objects, my sculptures and other things that I've made, as well as traditional instruments that we could give a voice to, so that would, when they're not being performed, sit there silently, and then the performance voices those objects. So really thinking about this idea or this tension between silence and not being heard and giving something a voice. And then I've worked with a choreographer, Savan Rubenstein, to create a dance as part of the performance, and then this incredible soprano, Marsha Lemke-Kern, whose parents were part of the Windrush generation here in London, to do this incredible soprano piece, but playing with the kind of choral traditions of church music, but also, again, those sort of sounds of, what loss really feels like in the body. In the performance, the Marsha is right up on the balcony where the organ traditionally would be located. So she's almost sort of occupying the space of the clergy or of the choir, but she's making sounds that we don't expect her to do. And then the dancer is moving around us through the pews in front of the films, engaging with the work. And then the percussionist, Louise Devenish, who's Australian, who came over here for the performance, and she's an incredible percussionist. I designed a percussion table, a copper top percussion table, where many of my sculptures were located, as well as traditional instruments, and then she sounded them through the performance. The percussion component was, incredibly, the sound was very rich, but it was also this incredible performance. Watching these objects come to life in front of the stand. So the three performers all had, like the prayer cushions, where I'd taken stills from my film and had them printed onto silk. The costumes that the three performers had were all made by me as well. So the percussionist and the dancer both had these sort of silk gowns, quite not dissimilar to religious sort of gowns that the clergy might wear, sort of robes, I guess. And they were details of the cliffs of Dover, so the view that migrants would experience or see when they arrived on the Kent coast in the small boats that many people are crossing on. Every aspect of the exhibition kind of connected.
Yes. A huge number of aspects all connecting.
Yeah.
Is that typical of your work, to be so multimedia, to be so affecting people on so many levels in so many different artistic formats? Or did you choose that for this work? You spoke about a kind of empathic response at the beginning. I've seen you reference engendering empathy with this work. Was it with that objective, or was it just this was all your artistic response and it came to this form as it evolved?
Well, the work was 2 years in development, so it really the wonderful thing about doing it over such a long period of time is I'm not creating loads of crap that the world doesn't need, because one of my concerns about the art world is that it is often just producing product for rich people. So I'm actually just really interested in the idea of slow practice.
Okay.
And how you can think about just really taking an idea and sitting with it for a long period of time. And what ends up happening is all the decisions that you make end up being very kind of carefully thought out. and very connected. So there's lots of ideas that I had that just didn't happen or didn't go out the window, or I didn't have the money to do, or whatever. So when you're doing something quickly, you don't always have that opportunity to kind of really be thoughtful and thinking in the choices that you make. And I think every time an artist makes a work, they want to improve on what they've done before. So I always think about my practice as sort of like all the big projects are like there's an umbilical cord that connects each one, where I think, oh, that's the thing that worked really well here, and that's the thing that I'm going to carry forward into the next work. And I think in a way that's what art can do, and that's what galleries and museums can do, but also it's a space that the church occupies. It's one of the few places, I mean, I'm not actually religious at all. I'm really interested in this as a cultural site, a site that claims to be one that enables people to seek refuge and safety, and particularly in Britain, that is just awash with churches, most of them empty. I'm interested in that, in the role that it plays culturally. But it's one of the few spaces where rituals of grief and loss are built into the tradition.
Right.
So, funerals, these sorts of contemplating, religious stories about loss and sacrifice and those sorts of things. So we don't really have much space for that in the world anymore. Everything's shiny and glamour and everything's great. And so I think art can feed into that space, because art also wants us to sit with difficult ideas. And there's also a tradition, obviously, in a museum space of sitting quietly and contemplating and slowing down. So it's really kind of, I guess, utilizing that capacity of the church to enable audiences to just sit with something. The performance is only half an hour, but just to sit with something. I certainly wasn't, because I'd been sitting through 5 days of rehearsal. So I was just, on opening night, I was just really thinking, oh gosh, have they got the right timing there? Yes. Has that worked? Have they done that? But I turned around and people were sobbing, people were crying. They were so moved by the work. And when I see that, that's when I think that, okay, it's worked.
What was the church's response to your use of the space? Did you get feedback there?
That's a really good question. Peter Babington, who's the vicar of the church, he was a very open. I think the only thing he said no to was when I asked if we could use the font, which is where they do the blessings, as one of the percussion objects in in the performance. I mean, he said to me on the opening night, I've never seen so many people in the church. Because we sort of had 300 people there,
right.
There was standing room only. It only seats sort of 80 or 100 people in any case. I think the church are increasingly understanding that art is a conduit to community. Yeah. And that they have to, particularly in cities like London, they have to think in a multi-faith way, because, Christianity now in Britain, I think, is a minority religion for the first time ever.
Right.
These are really interesting conversations that I guess they're having about what their role in society is.
And that location in London is surrounded by museums and galleries and academia, and Somerset House is, has its wonderful collection just right there in that building.
Exactly. So this church doesn't really have a congregation. Not really. They're not coming there to practice faith. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm sure they would love for people to be doing that, but that is increasingly less and less what their role is. And it's going to be interesting. There's a number of other church spaces around the world that might be interested in being a venue for this work. And I think, each space will have a different challenge and a different community and a different audience, and it may need to be adapted to make sure that the kind of messages in the work, speak to those particular places and communities.
It hits home when you describe your artwork. Do I describe it as an installation or a performance, or how do I describe Never at Sea?
That's a really good. I've been having trouble. I guess I describe it as an immersive exhibition and performance. Yeah, so the idea is that the films and the percussion table and the prayer cushions and all the other objects in the church, they remain as an exhibition during the day, and then the work kind of is activated through a series of performances. So we, in addition to the performances, I did an artist talk with the composer Kat Hope, and we've been collaborating together for almost 20 years. So we talked about that process. And I also ran a one-day symposium that invited arts organisations and artists who work in similar ways or have similar objectives to mine, to kind of, describe and share what it is that they do.
Yep.
And also to work across art forms. So when I invited the different arts organisations, so we had Phosphorus Theatre, who work with Syrian newly housed migrants in Britain who are not professional actors, to tell their stories on stage. I worked with Art Refuge, who work with migrants in Calais and Dover, to share their experiences through creative work, and an organisation called Three Rivers Bexley, who work with displaced people in and communities that through poverty and a range of other issues don't have access to the arts in sort of southeast London. Also an organisation called Innova, who house the Stuart Hall archive, but also work with and around Black British histories in Britain, who of course in particular, which is notable to this work, is the experience of the Windrush generation and their experience of migration to Britain, which we're recently celebrating the 75th anniversary of, and there's still many, many issues that community is experiencing even all these decades later. So I was really interested in how these different art forms, theatre, visual arts, community art, were all working to think about how you embed creative work and creativity and artists into their community work, essentially. Yeah, it was incredibly rewarding for them, because often you work in your little bubble and you don't get to hear what other people are doing.
And I think for this audience, it's extremely interesting that you used your performance space, the space that you'd kind of, some artists would see it as a space that they'd managed to kind of claim for their artwork. You actually used it in a different way. You opened the doors and invited in other people to share that space with you, to bring in to give access to other people, to give a platform to other people.
I have to say, Chris, that by that time I was really happy to not talk anymore. So I did not talk during that symposium. I was kind of struggling to get a sentence together. No, I think it's very much part of how I work. So I mean, you'll hear from the way I describe Never at Sea that I've worked with lots of people. So I've worked with my incredible composer Kat Hope, my incredible choreographer Sivan Rubinstein, incredible dancer Lydia Walker, Marsha Lemke-Kerm, the soprano, and Louise Devonish, the percussionist. But then there's all these other people behind the scenes. I've had students working with me. I had 20 volunteers of my students, who got to learn about the work and talk to audiences and get experience with that. I've worked with the Refugee Council, with a group of refugee women over April for a month at the Science Gallery. So I am interested in creating, not just through the outcome, but through the actual practice of making a sort of a community of care, so that everyone feels held, everyone feels valued, everyone feels that their voices are contributing and that they're getting something out of it, and that the process is not exploitative. So I always want, and I've always worked like this, I always want people to go away from my film shoots or whatever it is that I'm doing and just feel that they've had a really good experience, that they've eaten well, that they've been paid properly, and that they've had something that transforms their thinking and their own practices as well. And I think it was interesting on the opening night, I sort of stood up and I just had the sort of 3 pages of all the people to thank who've been involved in the project. And a few people said to me afterwards that was really unusual for an artist to do that, because most artists will stand up and just take all the applause. But it was like,
that's your moment.
No artist makes work on their own. Maybe a painter, but no artist working across art forms does things on their own. And I think the visual arts could learn a lot from that model, actually.
There's so many things to pull together there, aren't there? Which I'm listening and grasping how you've managed to pull together so many elements, and you explain it so straightforwardly and clearly. But as I listen to you, I think in your research work, you have scrutinized the art industry. It's something that you look at critically and question it, and question the kind of colonial legacies and the avenues of who's kind of welcome, or who can enter that industry, and how different people can enter it. And your practice, when you talk about slow practice too, that's a very kind of, it goes at odds to an industry where often, in order to survive within that industry, you need to produce, you need to make money, you're working within a certain structure in order to be what's kind of thought of as a kind of successful or working artist. Time limits are often very limited. Money is the drive. And of course, with people with less money and with less access to the industry, that's probably even a stronger incentive, a stronger motivation all the time. How quickly can I produce something which might make me some money, which might get me on this treadmill, and of course, all of that is a legacy in most countries of a colonial past, of the way that wealth is constructed, of the way that art is placed, and the value that's given to art as only being accessible to certain people. It is, we know, a very deliberate choice. That's a deliberate situation we've ended up in.
Yeah, no, Chris, you're absolutely right. And that really came home to me when I moved to London, which of course is just steeped in class and privilege and the market as well. And actually, it was that very experience that drove a lot of my other research into gender inequality in the art world in particular. But I had done this massive project at Carriage Works and with Performance Space in Sydney, I think in 2014, and I thought, gosh, this would be a perfect project to tour in the UK somewhere. So I must have sent off 100 emails to people saying, I've got this work, it's ready to go, and I think I got one response back. And it was from a director of a museum outside London. And he said, look, I can't take the work, but I'm happy to have a chat with you about how this whole art world in the UK works. And he said, look, no one's going to take the show on because you don't have a commercial gallery here in London. No one has the money to take on a project of this scale. You need a commercial gallery to back you. And I was a little bit shocked because it's just not how things work at all in Australia. Okay. It's quite normal for artists to have a direct relationship with museums and curators and to negotiate that. And importantly, museums do have resources to take on those sorts of projects, which due to Arts Council funding here over the last 2 decades is just simply not the case anymore. So at the same time I was having that conversation, I also, one of the big commercial art galleries here in London, Listen Gallery, had opened up their first New York gallery space, and they had an image on their Instagram and it said something like, just some of our artists, and it was 30 men and 1 woman. And it was, ironically, it was the opening of an amazing female artist called Carmen Herrera. But all of their artists in the image were men, and I was so shocked. And I went onto their website, and I thought, my goodness, of the 52 artists they represent, only 11 of them are women. So that I put those 2 things together. So if museums can't afford to take on artists unless they're supported by a commercial gallery, and commercial galleries are only representing largely white privileged men, what is that going to do to our institutions and to our collections and to, what these spaces represent about society? And I mean, we all fantasize as artists about, just being artists and sitting around in our studio all day and only having to make art about things that we want to. But, of course, the only people that can do that are people with inherited wealth, because everyone has to work otherwise. Now, my work choices have simply been to be an academic, because then I'm not a slave to the market. I don't have to make work to sell. I have a salary, and that gives me the privilege of being able to make work that maybe is uncomfortable for people. And that's the choice that I make. It means I can't sit around in the studio all day. I have to do academic work as well and teach and all those things, but it's something I love to do anyway, so that's quite lucky. But you're absolutely right. There are fewer and fewer artists able to sustain themselves in places like London, and the market is shaping everyone's career. So you get very average, even bad artists who have some sort of privilege or are making some kind of work that some collectors like, and all of a sudden their work is elevated, and other artists who perhaps don't have that privilege or are making difficult work and important work, because art should be a little bit difficult. I mean, historically we know that. We look back through time, and all the artists that we might venerate now were all very difficult in their time. So who are those artists now, and why aren't they being supported?
Mm-hmm.
And will they end up in the history books? Probably not.
Yeah. How do you speak to your students about this?
Yeah, that's the big challenge, because I run a MA module called Art and Globalization on my and then I do a BA module, a third year BA module called Issues in Contemporary Art,
mm-hmm.
and my students often come and they're really excited about art, and I have to really work really hard to not just be really negative and tell them how the art world is terrible and they shouldn't participate. I mean, I suppose I see my role as an academic is to create a critically thinking mind. So even if they go on and work for the SYNCR Gallery or whatever, that they go into those spaces with the capacity to think critically about what's around them.
Yeah.
So you can love and hate something at the same time.
Yep. Yeah. I'm a musician. In my music degree, there was never a critical voice.
No.
I was being trained to take a place within the system that was there.
Yeah.
It's damaging in many ways. It's damaging to many individuals that go through that training, but it's certainly that the system itself was never in question.
No, and it's never even taught, even if it's not critically, it's never even explained. So I think this is what happens to lots of artists. They leave art school and they think, oh, I'm just going to make art, and if I make good art, then everything will be fine. Yeah. But actually, it's got nothing to do with the art you make, or very little, or not as much as it should.
Mm-hmm.
And artists that have art students that have the opportunity to find out how the system works
mm-hmm.
have the opportunity to either participate in it or challenge it. But if you come out of art school, as I did, just having no idea, or even more recently when I moved to London in my late 30s and just not understanding this ecology,
mm-hmm.
just feeling incredibly naive. These are the important things that best prepare students for the future, really.
Yeah. So thinking again of the audience of this network, which is organizations working with refugee populations, people that have migrated for multiple and increasing reasons, but to seek asylum in countries which seem safer. These are lessons which are critically important for artists arriving or musicians arriving and walking into a different ecosystem where their skills just will operate differently. There's a system that operates differently, and therefore people's skills and people's knowledge or people's culture will just be viewed differently. That's incredibly hard. I mean, you're coming from Australia, and of course, I think of Australia as similar. And compared to we're talking about a very different actual artistic ecosystem going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so in the workshops that I ran with the refugee women, so I structured the workshops around the kind of creative elements in the project. So I did one about objects and images, one about sound and music, and one about dance and movement. And the first one about objects and images, I asked everyone to bring with them something from home as a starting point to talk about home and journey. And rather stupidly, everyone said, I have nothing. I don't have anything from home. I came with what was on my back. In hindsight, I should have anticipated that, but I didn't, because as you say, my experience of journey was, yes, I didn't come with much, but I came with something. Whereas many of these women, mostly Syrians, had just sort of left in the middle of the night, had anticipated that they'd be able to return home shortly, and they had nothing. And so that whole conversation was actually about loss and absence. And you realise how important those sort of cultural objects are to identity. And when you don't have them, one of the women, all she had was some images on her phone of her family that had all died and of her home. And then her phone got stolen in the first week of being in London. So she literally had nothing. She didn't even have a photograph. In a way, I see it's not so much thinking about people as trained musicians or artists coming here, but also thinking about arts and creativity as a method to re-establish and share and knit communities back together. So my intention was never to turn any of those women into artists, but to actually use a creative forum to create community. And I think that's what a lot of the organisations that spoke at my forum were trying to do, was thinking about how art becomes the glue. Mm-hmm. It becomes the thing that brings people together, that enables them to have a platform to share their stories, to connect with other people with similar experiences. And it was amazing. By the end of the workshops, we were all sort of, dancing and moving and meditating together and having these, and all of these women who didn't know each other previously now do. Mm-hmm. So all of the workshops were about loss. So the one on sound and music, they brought with them sounds from home, but they also talked about the absence of sound in London. Yeah. So the absence of the call to prayer, the absence of the language that's familiar to them around them, the absence of smells, the absence of tastes of particular food that they can't locate here, those sorts of things. So it was really, I guess I'm thinking about culture in the broader sense, that they really were able to share with me things that I hadn't thought about before. Like when your day is marked by the call to prayer and you just have silence. They were fasting at the time, and they normally for evening meal, all the street would get together and everyone would make a different dish and they'd all come together and share the evening meal. But, they didn't even know who their neighbours were. Everything changes. And I think the arts can play a really important role in reframing, reshaping those communities. So I guess for me, I'm interested in those dual things, what I can do as an artist, what platform I can generate to change hearts and minds, but also in making the work, how can I also engender positive experiences of community and connectedness by bringing different people into the making of the work.
Kate, thank you very much. That was a fascinating, beautiful conversation. I'm quite moved. I really appreciate you spending the time with us, for sharing your work with us, for sharing your ideas so openly. Our listeners can find you at katemcmillan.net.
Thanks so much, Chris. Yes, and Instagram is also a good one. I do forget to update my website. But it was an absolute pleasure talking with you today, and looking forward to chatting with you again. And thanks for giving me this platform to just talk about the project.
Thank you very much. ReSounding is brought to you by the Art27 Network, a network of like-minded initiatives using art and culture to respond to the ongoing crisis of displacement of human beings in Europe and around the world. To find out more and to join our growing network, you can visit our website, art27.art, or follow us on Facebook at art27. This podcast was produced and edited by Ed Holland. The theme tune was written by Matteo Galesi in collaboration with SYNCR. Thank you for listening.